one more minute to go ahead and grab snacks, water, whatever you need to make your space comfortable. And we'll get started in just a minute as folks are signing on. All right, well, we'll go ahead and jump in and get started. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm excited to dive into really what are essential knowledge and skills for supporting environmental educator growth. And yeah, dig in and have some conversations about this. So we appreciate you joining us. If I haven't met you yet, my name's Katie. I'm the director here at the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education, and I've been a part of the National Project for Excellence's Trainers Bureau for probably over 15 years now. And so it's always exciting when some new resources and tools come out that we get to share. If you're not familiar with the CAEE, we're glad you're here, and I hope to see more of you in the future. We're a professional association for anybody and everybody who is teaching about the environment in some way. And our members are teaching about the environment in many different contexts and many different settings. But we're all working towards these shared goals of amplifying and elevating environmental and outdoor learning. Few things to put on your radar before we get started. We do have some fun events coming up that you might be interested in. On March 26th, we're going to have our certification office hours. So if you know anybody who's working on their certification portfolio, which are based on these guidelines that we're going to talk about today, they can always join this and ask any questions that they have. We've got our spring conference coming up on April 10th in Grand Junction, and we're going to be focusing all around water and climate justice. So it should be a great session. And then April 16th, we have another webinar coming up around climate communication, audience psychology, and really looking through the lens of wildlife as the story that we're exploring. Hope you can join us for that. And then, of course, certification portfolios are due on April 20th. So today, for the next 2 hours, we are going to really dive into this new set of guidelines in the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. So we'll talk a little bit about what they are, and then we'll kind of dive into those guidelines and, you know, we framed this workshop as for folks who are supporting educator growth and development. And so, really diving into a little bit of like, where might an educator struggle? Where have you seen educators struggle with some of these things? And we'll dive a little bit deeper into those key characteristics and what those might look like. And we'll close by reflecting on our own practice. So hopefully it'll be a great opportunity to dig in. I do want to give the caveat that this will be interactive. We might do some small groups. We might do some sharing in the chat. Um, we know that you're here because you are helping support develop environmental educators and you bring a lot of expertise. And so we want to give the opportunity for folks to learn from each other. So we invite you to participate, share as much as you are able. We also know there's lots of things going on, so please take care of yourself as you need to. But just to kick us off and get our brains kind of turning, we're going to just do some opposite thinking and think about what qualities or practices make a bad environmental educator. What are not qualities or practices that we want to uh, promote. So feel free to take a moment to think about that in your head, add those to the chat, and in a minute or so, we'll give folks the opportunity to unmute and share out loud, but take a moment to think to yourself. We've got some great things showing up in the chat. Telling students what they should be learning, not asking open-ended questions. Sage on the stage, focusing on negative, only talking at participants, not asking questions, not connecting content to lived experience or places, talking in terms that are unfamiliar, rushing experiences instead of allowing time for observation, focusing on problems and not making time for solutions. Does anybody want to unmute and expand on any of those or things you've seen?
I'm happy to build on the one I put down there. I put two, but I do think the like Russian experiences instead of allowing time for the observation, wonder, and reflection. I run the school programs at South Platte Park in Littleton, and we have a lot of like K to 5 students is kind of our bubble range we deal with. And I think the best thing we can do is just really slow things down, give them a chance to have that little free explore and find the connections themselves, and really build environmental education into a, inquiry-based model that shouldn't be rushed through.
I love that. And I think that is, that exploration before explaining something is something that has changed in the last 10 years in education. And it's something that a lot of educators are still getting used to. And, a lot of us are, when we went through and we're learners, a lot of that information was presented to us rather than giving that time for figuring things out on our own. So that's definitely something that has changed over time and can take educators time to adjust to that and really rethink how to do that for sure.
Can I build on that?
Yes, absolutely.
I would just add, Kevin, thank you for getting us going with that. And I would just add, it's like there's this somewhere along the lines, somebody taught somebody that in order to be a teacher or educator, you have to tell people everything you know, and you have to do it. You have to cover a lot of content in a very short amount of time. Otherwise, you're just not successful. And I think that's all fallacy. And that actually we should that we have give ourselves permission to cover less content but do it much more effectively, like you were describing the how, Kevin, and Katie as well.
I love that. And I think too, it points out how much education and teaching practice and what's considered best practices have evolved over time. And uh, what we're going to explore today is like the second or third revision of these guidelines, and they are continuing to evolve and continuing to build in kind of new ways of thinking about how we engage in some of these practices. Any other thoughts or comments that folks want to add before? Well, keep thinking about that. Keep thinking about, what you've seen with educators that you're working with in helping support develop new educators or educators along any point in their path for sure. We'll kind of keep that in the back of our mind. So, you may have heard about the guidelines for excellence before. I know some of you on the call are very familiar with these, and some of you, these may be totally new. But if we think back in environmental and outdoor learning in the 90s, the field of environmental education took a lot of criticism because there were people that really felt like we were telling people what to think instead of really thinking about how to think. And it's the difference between save the whales and how should we let's approach this and examine issues that might be coming up with whales and in the ocean, those types of things. And so in the early 2000s, NAAEE, the North American Association for Environmental Education, really took on the task of we need to put some best practices down on paper. We don't have any of this written down. This is a field. We have people who are trained in doing this work are going to be better at it. And we need to make sure people don't feel like this is fluffy or that we're using practices that aren't appropriate. And so, really, in the early 2000s, it was the first effort to really document those practices in a set of guidelines. Those guidelines have all undergone a similar process where thousands of educators have the chance to review and comment on them. So anytime you're looking at these, you know that there's been lots of thought and lots of feedback that has gone into what are these and what does this look like and what should we be sharing with the field. The environmental educator knowledge and skills guidelines for excellence were previously called guidelines for professional development of environmental educators. So if you've heard those two different things, know that this is the newest iteration of them. It was kind of the third in the series of guidelines that have come out. And there are 7 different sets of guidelines that relate to EE materials, EE programs, early childhood environmental education, community engagement, K-12 environmental education, and kind of like our standards for the field. So there's lots of resources that you can dig into and find. We're just going to tackle these environmental educator knowledge and skills guidelines for excellence today. But these are a set of recommendations about what we should all know and be able to do as environmental educators. Now, each of them won't apply in every situation. We're capturing a very wide swath of people that work in very different contexts. And so, really use these as a starting point. But there may be ones that are more important for the organization that you work with based on your mission, and ones that show up less frequently, and that's okay too. These particular guidelines are being used in a variety of ways, but here are a few examples, and I'd love you to share in the chat, like how you've used them, what lens you're coming to this conversation with. But particularly for this development of environmental educators and knowledge and skills of environmental educators, they're being used to develop certification programs across the country. They're used in higher education, and whether that's developing courses or programs within higher education, developing certificate programs, and even they have created an accreditation for higher education programs that are based on these guidelines. You can also use them for individual professional learning. Use them as a self-assessment. Where am I at? What could I spend more time on? where could I improve my skills? If you provide professional development to whether it's bringing on new educators, maybe you do professional development for teachers, for seasonal staff, for community members, whoever that is. These can be helpful in thinking about what do we want people to know and be able to do, and what could we incorporate more of within however we're helping develop environmental and outdoor educators. The new guidelines are divided into three big buckets when you think about the guidelines that are included here. And those big buckets are content knowledge and skills. And that's really about our own, what do we know that then we are able to teach about or share. Um, Foundations, responsibilities, and commitments is a category that is a little bit more about thinking about the history of the field, how we're continuing to use best practices, what our professional responsibilities are. And then design and implementation is a pretty meaty section. That's the actual doing of environmental education and understanding different teaching methods, understanding how to put together a lesson plan or a program, all of those pieces that kind of get broken out. There are 7 different guidelines that fall into these 3 buckets. So under knowledge and skills, it's environmental literacy. And again, that's our personal environmental literacy. In the foundations, responsibilities, and commitments, it's understanding the foundations of the field, professional responsibilities, and then this commitment to community collaboration and fairness. And then again, in this very meaty design and implementation bucket, we have planning for environmental education, implementing environmental education, and then assessment and evaluation. So there's a lot packed into those 3 key characteristics there in that section. Just to give you a quick drive through, if you haven't been through the guidelines before, um, when you open up the publication, they are divided into these key characteristics, those 7 that we just looked at. And so when you look at any particular key characteristic, that key characteristic is at the top. That's the big bucket. So here we're looking at key characteristic number 2, which is foundations of environmental education. And then within every key characteristic, there are 3 to 5 guidelines that break it down a little bit more. What's in the foundations of environmental education that we need to know? And so you can see here, this guideline is fundamental characteristics and goals of environmental education. Do we as environmental educators know that? And then finally, there are indicators under each guideline. And those indicators are not an all-inclusive list, but they are examples of types of things you might know or be able to do that really demonstrate that you understand that guideline. And so all of those might not apply to you, but they give you a good example of what that might look like when you're working with other educators. So that's kind of how they're laid out, just to give you a quick sense of that. But what I'd like to do is just spend some time digging into what these look like and give you a chance to explore them a little bit. And so we have created a workbook in Google Slides that we're going to use for this. And so I'm going to pop this link here in the chat for you so everybody can access it. And we're going to get into smaller groups. And In your group, you're going to take just one of those key characteristics. And so if you're in group one, you can take key characteristic one. And we're going to take 10 to 12 minutes in these small groups to chat about, uh, get to know that guideline a little bit and talk about what might a developing educator struggle with in here. Where have you seen educators struggle? What have you struggled with yourself? And what strategies could we use to support developing educators when we think about that particular key characteristic? For each key characteristic, there is a slide that has all of the guidelines listed on it, um, and a description of that. And then the next slide is a place where you can just jot down some notes with your small group, and answer those two big questions. What might a developing educator struggle with? And what are strategies you could use to support them? If you want to dig in deeper, if there isn't enough information on the slide, or you're like, what does this really mean? Slide 3 has links to the full document where you can just pop in there and see additional information if you would like to. So, Sarah Grove, I will ask you if you wouldn't mind putting people into groups of 3 to 4.
Perfect.
And again, that link is in the chat so you can see where you're at. Again, if you're in group 1, go ahead and do key characteristic 1. If you're in group 2, do key characteristic 2, and just dig into one of them. Dig a little deeper, see what it looks like. And we'll take about 10 minutes to do that.
All right, Katie, I think everyone's successfully in their room. Oh, you can't see me. Sorry. Um, I think I'll hang out here because I think we've got folks in every one of them. So I'll hang out with you.
You're welcome to join one.
Okay.
And we can pause the sharing or pause the recording or
Yeah, let's do that.
all right, welcome back. Well, hopefully that gave you a chance to dig into at least one of the key characteristics in a little bit more depth. And we'll walk through them kind of one at a time and just chat about what you chatted with. And we didn't have 7 groups, so we'll do some group conversations for the ones that we didn't have a group tackle. But let's start with key characteristic 1. So this is all about it's not about teaching practice, but it's about what we know, and what skills we have as educators. There are 6 different guidelines within this key characteristic: awareness and appreciation, earth processes and systems, human systems, application of systems thinking, action strategies and skills, and personal and civic responsibility. And I'd love to hear from group 1's conversation, if anybody's willing to share. When you think about this key characteristic, what comes up as things that folks struggle with?
Anybody want to share
Anybody
from our
from
group?
group?
I can share if nobody else wants to share. I don't know if you want to go to that slide, Katie, or if you want me to just talk through what some of the things we put down.
You can
I'll
just
just talk.
talk through it.
Okay. Well, we just kind of talked about how it's a lot. It's a lot to feel like you know all of these things. I mean, all these buckets are huge. So we just talked about educators may feel like they don't know everything, especially if they're coming into a new location, into a new environment, they might not know all of the systems and animals and plants, all the things that are in this new environment that they're in. And so it can feel kind of overwhelming, and also like you have to maybe learn on your own time, and also confidence in your sources. Where are you getting the information? Is that the information you want to be passing along? And then for the strategies piece, we really talked about how, the educator can be learning alongside of their participants and doesn't need to know everything. We talked about at the very end, I thought a really good comment was, the supervisor sharing the expectation that they don't, you don't need to know all of this, but you do need to be curious, that these are the expectations that I have. Um, and really leaning into connecting the skills that you already have to that new location or to that new teaching environment, and trying to build some confidence from the experiences that you do have. And then finally, just being flexible, and how you're teaching, and if you don't know something, again, that being able to pivot and be curious alongside your learners for that. So anything I missed, group one?
Feel free if you're from another group and have observations, feel free to throw them in as well. Well, I agree. At least I think there is a lot in this one. And I think something that is important to kind of think about when we're thinking about this environmental literacy, um, this isn't going to look the same for everyone. If you teach preschool, then the depth of understanding of earth processes and systems might be different than if you're teaching an earth system science class for a higher ed group of students. And so, depending on what your context is, these things might look different for different educators. And I will say one thing that I think is, um, with this new set of guidelines, if you are someone who has been using the old set, what I think we're seeing in this new set is a lot more specificity. These were in larger buckets before. Earth processes and systems and human systems were in one big bucket called environmental systems. So I think there was a recognition on the part of the writing team to say these are really big. We actually might need to break these apart and think about these. Couple other things that I just wanted to flag when we're thinking about key characteristic one. Um, when we look back at previous editions of guidelines, the awareness and appreciation guideline is very new. So that's brand new in this set of guidelines. Um, you don't find it in the previous version. And I think we're seeing that evolution in the field and that recognition that connection with nature and our own personal connection with nature as educators, we're seeing that show up more in the research and the literature. And so you are seeing it specifically called out here as something that we should think about for ourselves, not just for our students. And so it's exciting to see that included in this uh, new way of thinking about this. I'm curious, for applications of systems thinking and action strategies and skills, if anybody is just willing to share, like, for you, when you hear that as a bucket of things to know, like what comes up for you that would be part of being able to apply systems thinking or action strategies and skills?
I can jump in. I think this is especially action strategies is like the so what, like Um, like if I personally, as the practitioner, need to be able to answer the so what of why am I doing this, and that's step one, and then step two would, or it's also important that the participant understands the so what. Like, so what? We learn about how cool, frogs are, but who cares? And so I think this is addressing that, and then um, and you can do this at all these different of ages, scales of how much engagement you have with these people. Like all of these have to be applied at whatever your different scales are. But anyway, and then they think about systems thinking. It's like how is that frog connected to what I care about? And how is that connected to something else? And that's so it doesn't have to be super complex depending on that scale. Um, but it's the so what. And I also want to just add, I'm thinking about scaffolding of like when Lisa was talking about the practitioner, the boots on the ground. Like this is a lot, but I also think about like scaffolding this for ourselves and for perhaps those, when I say ourselves, I mean environmental educators, but there's so many scales of that too. So like whether you're the summer college intern or you're wherever you might be in your career path, but scaffolding this in a realistic manner that helps people feel successful and helps people feel like this is attainable as opposed to this is overwhelming. And knowing that um, this is like an exciting opportunity into a profession that's like beyond what they probably imagined was even a thing, um, I think would be a really great way to process this in our own heads. um,
I love that. I love that, Sarah. That's a really great point.
mhm.
And just from, looking about how some of these practices have evolved, that application of systems thinking and action strategies and skills used to be called skills for understanding and addressing environmental issues. And so again, I think we're just shifting the language a little bit of how we talk about things and opening up that a little bit. And really thinking about before we ask learners to do these things, like, are we able to do them ourselves and are we practicing them uh, in our own in our own lives, in our own practice? So um, those are all great things to be thinking about. For key characteristic two, um, this one I will say didn't have a lot of changes from what we've seen in the past. But it's really about a little bit more about the history of the field. Um, what are the fundamental characteristics and goals of EE? How is environmental education practiced? And what's been the evolution of the field? So I'm curious from group two, what were some big takeaways from your conversation? What might educators struggle with here?
I'm going to nominate Kevin or Chris to be the speak, or not Chris, or Aaron, Kevin or Aaron to be the speaker.
I can match that voluntold. No, I'm just kidding. That volunteer moment there. Aaron, of course, or if anybody else wants to add in, please. I think with this one we were chatting about the foundations of environmental education as always, as the characteristics said, and kind of got rolling in the like how outdoor education and environmental education can mean different things, and it's not just it's outdoor ed is like one piece of environmental education, and how the history of the field has really moved from this earlier definitions of environmental education as kind of this behavior management of citizens to help in with the management of a resource to more of this kind of relational piece that we are feeling a little bit more in modern environmental education and like really adding in the nature as not something that is managed, but something that is that we are in relationship with. And so we kind of talked about how, the history side of things is a really great place for developing environmental educators to get kind of those foundations in, but also it could be a struggle because the history is not always included, and like how do you kind of talk about the evolution while also making sure that we want to, push towards where we are today. And so that kind of side of things, as well as just um, a theory that is like lived by the individual experience. Sarah was adding in about the like importance of like when you come into a space, you're a human first, and not necessarily just there to be a representative of your organization or whatever you're kind of leading on that trip, but using, your own experiences and your own passion for nature and environment in a way that helps kind of go towards the further learnings. And really, this idea of like, knowing that they're standing on giants, the shoulders of giants, as Sarah put it, which I think is a great way to phrase it in terms of like the lineage that exists with environmental education. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other observations folks want to throw in here?
There was just a big shout out to why the EE courses are wonderful because Erin reminded us that they exist and that this kind of training doesn't usually show up in everyday training for especially small organizations that don't have huge capacities. And so this is where it would be awesome to encourage. What we can do is encourage people to take the EE courses on the foundations of environmental education.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting one because, you know, there are people who go to school and have training in terms of becoming an environmental educator for sure. And then there's a lot of people who enter the field because they are really passionate about the environment. And there's a lot of people who enter the field because they have an education background and are interested in teaching. And so folks may come to some of their first work experiences without any of these pieces. And like when do you layer these pieces in and when are they helpful and how do we think about some of those things? So just as a little exercise, pull out a sheet of scrap paper, write the numbers 1 to 5 on that scrap paper, and on for number one, I want you to answer the question for whatever the educators that you are supporting their development. Why is it important for them specifically to really understand the history of the field? And then I want you to write, look at that answer. And then on line 2, answer the question why. And then on line 3, for whatever you wrote on line 2, answer the question why. And just take yourself through that process to dig a little bit deeper. Take about 30 more seconds to finish up whatever thought that you're on. Would anybody be willing to share like what audience they were thinking of and what their core why is for them?
I'm I'm happy to jumpstart it, and see if anyone wants to pile on there. And so as I mentioned earlier, am the school programs coordinator, and so I have a staff of like 6 to 7 educators, as well as volunteers that we run field trips and school programs. And so, like I mentioned before, I think the relational piece of environmental education is really important, and especially with, oh, sorry if you're hearing the phone. Someone else will get in the office. The Especially with like kindergartners, I'm all about, setting those foundations of environmental stewardship and things. And so my first why was like deepening the relational piece. I think that's a helpful, reason for it. My why from there was to help participants build real relationships, not just learn facts. The why from there built into relationships lead to care, because people protect what they feel connected to. From there, I went into my next why was emotional connection, motivates behavior more than facts alone, and then ended up at environmental challenges require action, not just understanding. And so, like, building from that relational side, leading into an empowering action, is kind of where I like to and want to guide my staff for the reasons to kind of get those foundations.
Love it. Thanks for sharing, Kevin.
Oops.
I'll share a different perspective. I started with to understand where EE fits in the grand scheme of society. To increase, the number two is to increase their understanding that it is a profession. And number three, that they are part of something much bigger that's very intentional. And then that the fourth was they belong, and ultimately they're adding to the field and contributing to this greater. They might be writing the guidelines for excellence in 10 years.
Yeah. So, and what audience were you focusing on, Sarah?
Oh, at large.
Awesome. Well, I think this is an important question to think about. I think we probably see a lot of looking at the fundamental foundations of EE when you're in a higher ed program and taking a course. And I think we probably see less of this embedded into when you're training your seasonal staff. And it's okay wherever it falls on the list. You may say, when I'm training my seasonal staff, risk management is the first thing I have to cover, and the second thing I have to cover is X, Y, and Z. And it will fall out wherever it falls out. But it's important for us to ask the question and just ask, why are we including it, or why are we not including it in our work to develop educators, and are there ways we could be including it? And so just kind of continually checking back in on that, I think is really important. Just one other thing that I will point out that's in the guidelines is there are supporting resources, and one of the supporting resources is defines a bunch of parallel movements. And I think one of the really things that's really helpful about having an understanding of this key characteristic. And when you understand how the field has evolved and some of the things that influence the field or might be these parallel movements, it opens up a lot more resources for us and a lot more ways and practices that we can pull from to build our repertoire. And I think um, sometimes knowing where those parallels are or really understanding kind of where we're drawing things from can help just open up the our own study and learning so that we can draw and pull from more of those parallel things. So it's a cool resource to tap into and think about how some of these things are similar and different, and kind of, understanding that big picture that Sarah was talking about. I think now would be a great time to take a quick stretch break before we jump into key characteristic 3. So take about 5 minutes. We'll meet back here at about 6 after, but feel free to grab anything you need, and we'll see you back in a few minutes. All right. Well, hopefully that gave you at least a few minutes to stretch or stand up or grab what you needed. I'm going to go ahead and dive right back in. I do want to spend a little bit more time on key characteristic number 3, because I think this is another one where we saw a lot of expansion and shift in the way we're talking about some things within this key characteristic. We didn't have a group that dove into this one, so I'm gonna, in just a minute, I'll invite you to share what you think educators might struggle with, but we'll kind of take them as they come and just do some group discussion from here on out. So key characteristic number 3 is about this professional responsibilities. Are we setting a good example uh, as we are educating? And so things like exemplary EE practice are in there. Are we using best practices? Environmental information, misinformation, and disinformation, and understanding that. Facilitation of critical thinking and action skills. Reflective and reflexive practices, and ongoing learning and professional development. Are we continuing to build our own practice over time? So these are all things that kind of we should be thinking about as our responsibilities as educators. Just making some very quick observations. Does anybody willing to share anything that maybe they've seen educators struggle with or that might be challenging in thinking about some of these guidelines?
I to add on to what Sarah has in the chat there too with the ongoing learning in PD, I think in our industry and in our career in our field, we're dealing with, I don't have to the like eco trauma of all of it and like teaching these environmental ethics in the time that we're living through. And so while they get like stuck in a rut in terms of the like ongoing learning in PD, it can also sometimes feel overwhelming with that component to it too.
For sure. For sure. I think that's a really good observation to make in terms of the context that we're in right now. I think too, one thing that I think about is often, maybe not all the time, but often environmental educators are operating in a lot of time constraints, and really thinking about how to do critical thinking well is challenging, and that takes time. Involving learners in action takes time. How do we do that? So I definitely think navigating just the context that we work in can be a challenge in terms of some of these pieces. And Julian, I love your comment. It can be hard not to put too many of the educator's personal views into teaching. And that was actually something I wanted to dig into a little bit more, because we have seen, like, this is where we're seeing a big shift in how the field is talking about this. Um, and so previously, the best practice that was shared with educators and in previous versions of this guide, and I know I definitely took courses that talked about, we need to emphasize education, not advocacy. And I think there has been a lot of shifts in terms of how people talk about advocacy in the last 10 or 15 years. This has always been a really challenging piece for the environmental justice community who are engaging in education. And they're like, we need to advocate this. That's part of what we do. And the idea here, I think, is still very similar. But because the idea behind this guideline was, we want learners to form their own views. So we want to facilitate a process that we're not telling them what our view is and that they should adopt it, but we're facilitating a process where they can adopt their own views and really think about what their attitudes are. And I think that's still true, but kind of pitting education and advocacy together really um, rubbed a lot of feathers the wrong way, I would say, for sure. And so we see that language changing here and thinking about what is environmental information, misinformation, and disinformation. And I actually had to go back and ask, like, what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation? Misinformation is when you might get something wrong. There's a misunderstanding. Disinformation is when you're actually intentionally providing information that is not factual, not true, and but that was intentional to mislead someone. And we see a lot of both of those things. Uh, Probably always, but it feels like especially now. So it's nice to see that called out. And then in this facilitation of critical thinking and action skills, when you look at what those indicators are and what that means and looks like, it is exploring multiple perspectives, and it is giving learners a chance to form their own opinions and take a position on something. But I think the recognition here is that as educators, we all have bias, we all have views, and it's not that you shouldn't share them, but you should share them carefully. And so that learners know that they're not just expected to adopt your views. Um, but I think the shift in language here is really positive and gets at some of that nuance that we weren't getting at before when we were supporting educators and figuring out how to navigate around this. So I would love to just hear from folks. How does this shift feel to you? How will it change how you support the educators that you work with? Take about a minute to just think about that, and then we'll share out. Is there anybody that does incorporate this into some of their training? And how does this shift feel to you? Let's see, Julianne said, really like how the shift of focus is on engaging students in getting their ideas, opinions, and perspectives. Sarah Grove thinks about grace and the willingness to be humbled to learn something new. Uh, and Aaron added education versus advocacy sometimes felt at odds and got muddled with the emphasis on personal and civic responsibility. And this feels clearer. And I agree. It was the language always like, we want to teach people to be advocates, but as educators, you can't advocate. And that gets really sticky and confusing. So I agree. This feels clearer. Uh, I admit it will take me a while to get used to. I have some of that old language like stuck in my head, but I think this will be a positive shift for how we can really address some of these things with developing educators. All right. Well, key characteristic 4 is all about a commitment to community collaboration and fairness. And a lot of what's in this uh, key key characteristic is new or new language at least, or it might have shifted from some other places. But it's really around being community centered, establishing an environment that is collaborative and promotes belonging, and emphasizing fairness. Um, and when we talk about fairness, I think without reading some of the supporting material, that could go in a lot of different directions. What really is the meat behind that fairness piece is making sure that we are conveying that some communities are impacted more by certain environmental issues, environmental disasters, whatever it might be, knowing that certain communities are impacted differently than others, and bringing those different perspectives and um, knowledge into the work that you do is really what's behind that one. But I'll just open it up to the group. Uh, is there anything here that jumps out as something that educators might struggle with, or something that you'd like to incorporate more into how you work with developing educators?
I think a little bit about the community centered piece of this. And I think that's a really great way because you don't know what's fair if you don't know your community. You don't know if someone's not being treated fairly. So I think it's all connected in a really nice way. And I'm thinking about specifically like summer camp instructors who often are seasonal, often come from across the country. And so they're not connected with that community when they land there. And so how can an organization provide a bulletin board of community activities or encourage community activities at their site, even is something that I've always been a bit curious about. I do know that a lot of places try to build community within their organization for their summer camp instructors or those seasonal instructors. And how can we bring that beyond just the team and the organization and out into the broader community?
I love that. And that community centered, I think, um, is being pulled in now after the community engagement guidelines were developed, and we see some integration from different types of work. So it's exciting to see that here. And I love thinking about creative ways that we could support educators in learning about that. a lot of them do move across the country for different positions. Any other thoughts or comments that come up when thinking about
I
key
think, and
characteristics?
oh, sorry, Katie, I jumped on the end
Go
there.
right ahead.
And I was looking because I was getting our nature center was being circled by a red-tailed hawk just a second ago out there too, which was we have them nesting across the river now. It's very exciting.
I love
I love the word collaboration when it's put in here, especially around the ideas of community and what Sarah was just touching on. I think in the modern climate and space that we are in, it's something that a lot of educators and I know a lot of environmental educators are trying to like find our space in order to be a positive and productive member of our own community and where we can find kind of that purpose and not necessarily have that like helplessness that can sometimes come in with the environmental eco trauma and trouble that we're looking towards. And so I like to really build in with my staff about how like our role is that important piece and really can be something that is not only like a professional commitment that helps like fill our own bucket and give that little purposeful feeling, but can really be that medicine that I think a lot of us look for too.
I love that for sure. And um, there's some good comments in the chat as well about thinking about how a lot of groups really want to be more engaged in these type of efforts, and but it can fall to the wayside. So it's great to have it outlined as something that, hey, this is important. There's also a comment um, that it can be difficult to expect educators to forge these connections when they're seasonal or short term and don't have time to develop those relationships or connections. So um, understanding that maybe they shouldn't be the ones leading the effort at that stage, but getting to know the community and understanding where your learners are coming from is still really important for sure. Um, and that hopefully it'll give more flexibility from funders to focus on some of these efforts. I love that. I hope that's true. Um, One thing I will note with this one is I think they were very careful about the language that they used here, and these guidelines and the work to put them together was funded by the federal government, and so I think you won't see some acronyms that we probably used previously, but I think there was a lot of work that went into this to make sure that the essence was captured. And I know I love the word belonging in terms of really thinking about like what's the end goal and what are we trying to achieve here. All right. Key characteristic 5. Just and now we're moving into this design and implementation phase. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a meaty bucket because this is all the doing. How do you put experiences together? How do you plan for some of these things? And in previous iterations, planning and implementation was all part of one bucket. And so you saw a lot less delineation and a lot less specificity here. But really, I think this breaks apart and looks at really the depth of knowledge and skill that really goes into planning and implementing environmental education. And there's a lot there. Um, Instructional planning really is looking at, do you have goals and objectives and do they match your actual activities? And, is Are you tying back to your bigger goals? Knowledge of learners is getting at age appropriateness. Are we planning the right activities for the learners that we have? Do we know where to find materials and resources to support the work that we're doing? Do we know how to evaluate quality materials and resources? There's a lot of stuff out there. It doesn't mean it's good stuff. Um, Settings for instruction. Are we thinking about the right place to for a for something that we're teaching? I know I worked my first season out of college was at the Grand Canyon, and um, one of the ways that the Grand Canyon formed was there's a huge uplift of the entire Colorado Plateau. The Colorado Plateau covers multiple states. You cannot see the uplift. And so that was something we put in a post visit activity. It wasn't something we focused on while we were there because you couldn't see it, you couldn't observe it. Um, so, really thinking about what's your setting, how are you using it the right way? Are you planning ahead for that? How does one lesson fit into the bigger picture of program planning or your year-round planning, or maybe you're working from a curriculum? Uh, how does it fit into a bigger picture? And then what tools and technologies can assist learning and what does that look like and how do we use those tools and technologies? And that technologies can mean everything from phones to magnifying glasses. So when we think about tools, we're thinking about a lot of different pieces. This is probably where a lot of organizations, this and implementing environmental education is probably where we spend a lot of our time. What experiences have you had? Where do learners or where do educators struggle? Where are places we should be digging more into?
Well, I think a couple things come to mind for me just hearing from some of our course participants that have, shared experiences. One is something that we touched on earlier is just trying to incorporate too many goals into the lesson plan. So I think that's sometimes an expectation of the organization or the teachers, or, there's just too much that, and like you said, it's just there's not enough time. And giving that time, like Kevin said, to being able to be flexible if something else comes up and to really allow that time for, where we know it's going to be most impactful. So I feel like that's something I've heard. I feel like educators sometimes just knowing those EE materials, there's a lot of like rush to kind of like create a new lesson plan and like not knowing that there's really a lot out there, but being able to connect it to the materials. I would say it's another one I've kind of seen through some of these courses.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think those are all really, really good points and good things to think about for sure. When we jump to key characteristic 6, and this is like obviously very, very Venn diagrammy with the key characteristic 5, the planning and the implementing go hand in hand. Some of the things we're looking at and really wanting to support educators with are, do they understand different types of methods that they could use in their instruction? Or are they using all games, all lecture? Um, are we mixing it up with different types of instruction? How are we creating a collaborative and welcoming learning environment? And again, you can see how some of this repeats with earlier guidelines. When we were thinking back in key characteristic 4 about collaboration and belonging. Um, This one is really focused on the actual, like, okay, so how do you do that? Tell me what that looks like in practice. Are we being inquiry based? Are we letting students figure things out on their own? I think, Kevin, you spoke to that earlier in terms of, do we give them time to explore? Again, we see this worldviews and perspectives show up that we talked about earlier when we were talking about education and advocacy. Are we bringing in multiple points of view? And this is one where I think that often what we see is folks assuming that that's something for older learners to do. And when we think about worldviews or perspectives, I mean, if you're working with kindergartners, it might be like, well, what do you think the bird thinks about that? What do you think the leaf thinks about that? And really just trying to put ourselves in different perspectives in different ways. And so I think there are ways to do that with all age groups. Again, this is civic action and engagement is another one that you'll see different nuanced ways of implementing. Like we saw this for our own selves that we should be personally and civically active. And then we see it here again in like, how do you do this with learners? And again, this is something that I think time ends up playing a big factor in. And then how do we be flexible and responsive? Kevin, you mentioned you've got a red-tailed hawk right outside your window. How are we taking advantage of some of those things? And what does that look like in our instruction? So I'd love to hear your observations. Again, this is probably one where we do spend a lot of time with the educators that we're working with. What do you see coming up again and again as things we need to dig into deeper?
I appreciate those callbacks to my little parts here too, and it is still looking around. It landed on top of the power line a second ago, and I was like, "Oh yeah, one of the best parts about working, right out at the river." Um, and I like for me and with my staff and what I hope to encourage for other environmental educators is we are obviously in the positions we are because of our own personal attachment to nature and our own passion for nature. And like anytime I'm out with a group of kids, if I get a like nature vibe from a wildlife like the red-tailed hawk, or if there's something that's going to be adapted into the program because of what maybe is choosing to show up that day, whether it's, deer tracks or a lot of mallards hanging around. And so I think that's one of the things that I've been trying to do with my team is rather than training them like specifically program by program, I've been trying to kind of teach them on mindset, and how we can set a similar mindset across all of our programs, into a more holistic interpretation style. Because I think if we can add in those sorts of skills and let the guide and the naturalist feel like they're leading from one particular mindset. Whatever happens along the way, whatever interests might pop out, or whatever those little kindergartners find in the river that day, we can roll with it, because we're all just kind of staying in line with our core values and the mindset that's put in place.
I love that. And it looks like Julianne added to the chat. This is one of the most fun parts. And it's the one that we will always keep getting better at with more experience, and you'll never truly master this one. Very, very true. And it changes with every context, every audience. Yeah, that flexible piece is something that I think will always be part of it for sure. I love that. Well, just one more key characteristic. And this one I think is something that the field as a whole struggles with. And actually, I think education in general struggles with this in terms of how do we really capture uh, what we're doing in assessment and evaluation. And so when we think about assessment and evaluation, the pieces that have really been pulled in terms of best practices that we need to be thinking about are, do our outcomes, our goals match what we see in the activities? Do they match what we see in the evaluation? Is all of that lined up? If our goal is for students to be more connected with nature, but the question on the evaluation is identify this tree, those things don't necessarily, that doesn't tell you if they've connected with nature. Learner assessment that is part of instruction. This is probably something we all do instinctually as check-ins and trying to get a feel for what our learners, if they're following us, if they're on track, and really thinking about different ways to do that and how we as educators can get cues into whether our learners are understanding the program, the content, the whatever it is that we're getting at. And notice the difference in the terminology here. So learner assessment is telling you what a learner knows. So if I did a learner assessment, it would tell me what Lisa knows or what Sarah knows or what Kevin knows. Whereas program evaluation is really about, is the program working the way it's supposed to be? So oftentimes you use lots of learner assessments and compile them all up, and that might give you data to tell you whether the program is working. Program evaluation isn't something we usually get into until we're further on in the field. We might help support it or help collect data, but generally learning how to design one is something that might come later. And I will say, our field has a lot of possible outcomes, and especially as we develop more connections with mental health and with positive youth development, there are a lot of avenues that the field has not explored in terms of what we could be collecting data on and what would be telling us if we're meeting our goals. So I think there's so much room to grow here as a field in general. And then finally, like, how are you using that data, whether it's informal data that you come off of a lesson and are like, gosh, when I was asking these questions, they were just really off track. Well, how do you use that to make changes and do it differently next time? Whether that's changing the program, changing the way you explain something, that could be on a very small scale or on a big scale, but how are we using that information to make changes? Any observations or things you would share about what's needed to help develop educators in these skills?
I'm thinking about some autonomy for educators to do some program evaluations themselves. And I might be on the back end of this a little bit of looking at portfolios, but it is hard for an educator who has curriculum that they're slipping into teaching to really develop that evaluation. So giving that educator either hey, this is what the organization's hoping to learn from an evaluation, or saying like, okay, educator, what do you want to learn about this? And why do you want to learn? Giving them that autonomy to do and facilitate those evaluations. And then to take it from there, like give them the next step of we've gotten the evaluation and what can we do to implement it from there. And I think that's really hard from an organization standpoint to give that to their full-time staff or their seasonal staff even.
For sure. And when you're looking at program evaluation, like, you have to have some consistency. You can't change it every time. Um, so yeah, it's is a hard thing to wrestle with in terms of getting that experience. And what are those bigger organizational goals for sure? And Julianne said another challenge is timing. Um, it can feel like we're just squeezing it in, um, and that isn't how it should be. And how do we make time for that reflection piece, uh, that piece that in every lesson that both gives learners a chance to reflect on what they learned and gives us a chance so that we can continue to improve the programming. For sure. Yes, time is always an issue with this one. Well, we made it through all seven. This is meaty. Thanks for hanging in there with us. And thank you for chatting either in the chat or coming off mute. Again, like your expertise is what is really helpful so that we can learn from each other. And I would just say, just a few reminders with these, like this is trying to capture for the whole field. So some are going to be more important or less important at different times. And we're really looking at the development of an educator over time. So we don't have to know all these things before we start. We build them, and this is what we're working towards. This is also something that we can use as uh, a frame of reference. It's kind of like a checkpoint to say, like, hey, where am I do like how am I building this into my to supporting the educators I work with? How am I not? Do I want to do that differently? And you might say, no, I like the way we're doing it. But it's a good question to stop and ask. And always remember that these can just be a source of credibility, and you can actually use these as a tool internally that then you can say for your organization, hey, we review all of our training against these guidelines. And that can be a way in grants or whatever that you establish. Hey, we're really preparing our educators because we're thinking about what these best practices do. A couple other things I just want to throw out there for you that are, if you're digging into the guidelines books, there's some cool resources that are spread throughout the book. And one of them is these did you know boxes. They'll kind of pop up throughout the text of the guidelines. And for anything that is listed in the guidelines, it offers a little bit more background information. So in 1.2, Earth systems, in that guideline, it talks about how you can learn about Earth systems through Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledge systems. So the Did You Know box breaks that down and gives a little bit more background information on what that is. There are also call outs to different resources. And so there's these resources you can use. So this is example that's listed in guideline 5.5, which is all about curriculum and program planning. And so it calls out, here's a couple national curriculums that are available. You can see how they're put together. And so throughout the guidelines, it will point you to additional resources. And then there's also these supporting resources. And so these are all in the appendix, but they provide like even more overview and background information. So, for example, 5.2, which is knowledge of learners. And you might go, gosh, I never did anything with knowledge of learners. And so you go back to this resource and it gives you an overview of like, here is the best science on how learners develop and what's happening at each stage. And so you can find that directly in the guidelines. And another good example of a resource you can use is like in that characteristics and goals of EE, when it's telling you to look back at some of these foundational documents in the field, there is a resource, a supporting resource that's like, here's where you find those documents. Here's what they are. So that can be super helpful, especially if you're designing a training, designing a course, whatever that looks like. And then finally, sprinkled throughout the guidelines are these guidelines in practice that are case studies of an organization and how they're putting that guideline into practice, just to give some examples and pictures of what that could look like. And so there's some cool stories in there that, we can all pull ideas from. So there's a lot in there. But as we kind of close up today in our last couple of minutes here, I'd love to just kind of take a minute to think about the ways that we each support educator development, and maybe pull out a piece of scratch paper, and I'll give you just a minute or two. When you think across these 7 key characteristics, where are your strengths? Where are you really strong in how you're supporting the development of environmental educators? I'm going to switch the slide here. Now I'd love for you to jot down a few notes about what key core characteristics could you incorporate more? What would you like to see? How would you like to intentionally incorporate some of these key characteristics into the ways that you are supporting the educators that you work with? I'm going to give you just 5 minutes, so it's going to go super quick. But I'm going to put you in groups of just 2, and would love you to chat about, like, what's one thing you'd like to take away? What's one strategy that you could think about incorporating when you think about these guidelines, um, about how you might incorporate them in? So you're just going to have a couple minutes to share that out. Welcome back. Hopefully you got a chance to share something out that you'd like to take with you. In these last couple of minutes here, I just want to say thank you for spending your afternoon digging into this. I just want to give huge gratitude for everyone that is part of supporting educators. It's really important, and it has huge impacts on the field and what our learners take away from the experiences that they have when our educators are prepared and feel confident and have the skills and tools that they need. So I appreciate you taking the time to dig in and think about this. We are going to send out the recording of this along with a copy of the slides. There are QR codes in here, both to take you to the direct link to the educator guidelines. So if you want to dig in more, you can. And then on the next slide, there's also a QR code that takes you to the bigger Guidelines for Excellence page if you want to dig into some of the other guidelines that are out there and what's available for you to dig into. And you can always feel free to contact us at CAEE. I know I personally love talking about this stuff, so always happy to chat more. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your week and just have really supportive, collaborative environments for working with the educators that you work with. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, thanks,